Hello and welcome to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. With the world facing multiple crises, we speak with three preeminent scholars from psychology, anthropology, and philosophy about the crossroads before us and the ways that we can navigate them for the betterment of humanity. Ervin Staub is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His books include Overcoming Evil, Genocide, of Violent Conflict and Terrorism, The Roots of Evil, The Origins of Genocide and Other Group Violence, and The Roots of Goodness, Inclusive Caring, Moral Courage, Altruism Born of Suffering, Active Bystandership, and Heroism. Doug Frye also joins us. He is professor and chairperson in the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He's the author of Beyond War, The Human Potential for Peace, and is the editor of War, Peace, and Human Nature, The Convergence of Evolutionary and Cultural Views. With Rian Eisler, he co-authored Nurturing Our Humanity, How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Minds, Lives, and Future. David Livingstone Smith joins us. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of New England. He's the author of Why We Lie, The Evolutionary Roots of Deception and the Unconscious Mind, The Most Dangerous Animal, Human Nature and the Origins of War, Less Than Human, Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others, and On Inhumanity, Dehumanization and How to Resist It. Welcome back to the Scholar Circle. It is so great to have the three of you here. Three esteemed scholars. Each of you have a fascinating perspective on conflict and cooperation and what it would take to make a humane and peaceful world. So I thought, given the times, David Livingstone Smith, drawing from your new book on Inhumanity, looking at the stressors that we're facing, it's hardly unprecedented, but we are facing some really complicated things, particularly with the pandemic, climate change, and as you note, the rise of authoritarians in positions of power all over the world. You're not very optimistic. Where do you see this going?
Well, here's the way I like to put it. I cribbed this from Cornell West. I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful. And by hopeful, I mean, I think there's a point in pushing on and trying to make the world the best place that we can make it. But I don't think the picture is very rosy right now. But of course, it's never very rosy. I mean, these things are an ongoing struggle. We have all over the world authoritarian regimes rising up, being very, very attractive to people. It's very, very disturbing. We have global climate change just over the horizon. Well, maybe even that's a foolish thing to say because it's affecting us now, but it will affect us much more severely as time goes on. And we will be confronted with massive refugee crises. And that, I'm afraid, is a perfect storm for people who want us to do terrible things to one another, to incite us to do so. So I think it's really, really important, particularly now, but really for all time, for us to understand the forces that incline us to disable our inhibitions against doing really, really horrible things to other human beings, to understand our own vulnerabilities to political rhetoric of that nature, and to be extremely vigilant about what the politicians and other people in positions of authority are encouraging us to do.
Yes, and you talk mainly about this in the context of dehumanizing each other. And
Right.
You pointed out that we all have this sort of propensity to do so, but sometimes we dehumanize the dehumanizers.
Yes. So by dehumanization, I mean something very particular. I mean the act of conceiving of other members of our species as dangerous or unclean subhuman creatures. We have a kind of psychological vulnerability to that. I don't think that arises from within us. In fact, if we're going to use the term human nature, which I don't like to use because it's loaded with undesirable connotations, human beings, I think, have pretty powerful inhibitions against harming one another, but we've developed over the centuries ways of undoing those and disabling those. And dehumanization is, to my mind, almost always prompted by propaganda, by rhetoric that plays on our vulnerabilities, that frightens us, that encourages us to commit atrocities against our fellow human beings.
It's actually a perfect way to bring in the other two panelists. Let's start with the anthropological. Doug Frye, you've got this kind of deep historic look, multicultural, long lens. How do you see this? It seems like you are a little more optimistic than David Livingstone Smith.
Well, yes, I probably am, but I certainly have to agree that we're in very difficult times now, and there are huge challenges facing humanity within our societies and at a global level, everything in between. So it's interesting, Maria, you honed in what I was going to point out, that with the perspective of anthropology, we go into the deep past on the one hand, and we also look across different cultural types and different societies, different cultures as well, to try to gather this big view and sort of try to tease out how flexible is humanity in terms of our inhumanity and our humanity. And with the book that you mentioned briefly, it's called Nurturing Our Humanity. And I want to make sure to say real clearly that I wrote it with Rianne Eisler, and she's the lead author. So it's Eisler and Frye. And what we really explore in the book is the potentials for humans to live in a real domination-oriented type of society on one extreme, and at the other extreme to have partnership societies where there's really a minimal amount of hierarchy, where there's gender egalitarianism and equality overall in the society, and a much lower level of aggression. So we talk about this in terms of a continuum, not an all or nothing, a yes or no, but rather societies can be spread out, and they are, in fact, if you look cross-culturally. So with this type of perspective, yes, I am more optimistic because I see societies ranging from the oldest type of human society, the nomadic forager bands, which are very partnership-oriented and really do not engage in warfare and really favor egalitarianism in their ethos and also in the way the society functions and are set up. And for the most part, they're very gender egalitarian. So they really are partnership societies. But fast forward to some modern cases like the Nordic countries, or the Netherlands for that matter, you see some of these same characteristics coming out. So this end of the continuum where humans are able to put down domination in an extreme form and in rigid hierarchies, and all of the negatives that flow from that, such as slavery and torture and warfare and it had plagued Western civilization and many other places for a very long time, and replace these types of hierarchies with democratic types of organizations, which are set up for functioning well for the whole society, not just part of the society. Yes, it's a bit more optimistic in that frame. I think obviously what Rianne and I are arguing is that we need to shift in the partnership direction. So will we be able to do that, and how quickly? That, of course, are open questions. But I think it's really important to understand that it's possible, and it's possible because there are societies that are partnership-oriented.
I want to dissect that in just a little bit, but before we do, let's bring Ervin Staub in. Now, Ervin Staub, you have looked at genocides, but you've also looked at reconciliation, even in those genocidal situations. How do you see things today as you reflect upon them?
And I am kind of a realist, partly because I have worked on so many real situations. Let me look at the United States for a moment. All the conditions here exist for group violence, as I have identified them in a whole different mass killings and genocides. Economic deterioration, social chaos and confusion, political chaos, a leader that dehumanizes people, derogates people, diminishes people. But we don't have great violence in the United States. Why? I think there are two reasons, probably, primarily. One is that our institutions are holding. The military has spoken out recently against Trump. Justices are not going along with him. The Supreme Court came out with two decisions that were contrary to what he wanted. And there is one other thing. Rather than derogating and devaluing primarily one group of people, he derogates everyone. He derogates the Democrats, who are about 55% of the population, I think. So that takes away some of his power to generate violence. Well, let me go to something completely different. We all know about incredible violence by the police against individuals and the long history of it. I developed a training a good number of years ago to get police officers to be what I call active bystanders, who intervene when a fellow officer does something unnecessarily harmful to someone. And we did this training very effectively and very successfully in a very bad police department that had a long history of such misbehavior, New Orleans. And there are many signs of its effectiveness. Now, how can that be? I think that the reason for positive behaviors are manifold. One of them is certain values, feeling of responsibility for other people's welfare that are individualist. Children can be raised that way. One of the ways they can be raised is what I call learning by doing. Get them involved in helping others and move them along. They need caring and affection. They need guidance. In order for children to be raised that way, unfortunately, adults have to undergo a transformation. Parents and teachers. Teachers often have characteristics that lead them to respond harshly to children who in any way they feel challenge them. So that is one realm. Another realm is what I call altruism born of suffering. It used to be that researchers identified people who have suffered as tending to be hostile and negative towards others. Actually, people who are violent criminals, who are not just criminals, but criminals in a violent way, have often been physically abused by their parents. So individual experience of being badly treated can lead others. But people who have suffered can also become caring and helpful. And I have written about the ways that that transformation can take place. But a third avenue is training. And the training is not only of individuals, it is transforming a whole community. Now, in this case, it's a small community. It's a police unit. We also want to ask, how do we transform a whole society? But even if you don't have the individual orientation to be caring and helpful, if you are part of a unit in which you are expected to behave that way, you are guided to behave that way, you are appreciated for behaving that way, and you are not appreciated and maybe punished if you behave in a negative way, that can be transformational. So the police culture requires an officer to join your fellow officer no matter what that fellow officer is doing, to support your fellow officer in everything. So if your fellow officer is violent, then at the very least, you remain passive, and more likely even, you join with that person. Now, that whole culture has to be transformed so that good teamwork is not now joining your fellow officer in doing harmful things, but it is to try to stop your fellow officer from causing harm. And this not only saves the civilian, but it also positively affects community police relations. It is beneficial to police officers who, when they discovered, are not going to be discharged from their jobs or criminally prosecuted. And it is also very beneficial to families, because when police officers are less stressed, they are less likely to be alcoholic, they are less likely to commit suicide, they are less likely to be abusive in their families, and it makes a big difference. So once you present this whole thing to police and get also superior officers involved, then it becomes possible with the proper training to transform the whole system. As a result of the training, people also come to stop themselves because they undergo some kind of a transformation. So community transformation, as you are suggesting, both of you, is very important. One of the questions and challenges is how can we raise it to a societal level, a larger institutional level and the societal level.
Just a reminder that you are listening to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian, and we're speaking with three preeminent scholars about the crossroads that we face today in these tumultuous times. Doug Frye, what can we learn from these various cultures and societies going back millennia that you have found that could bring about a transformation, not just in policing, but in society?
Values. This sounds funny, but some of the research that I'm doing right now really shows just how important having nonviolent or non-warring values in a society really are. And this is something that I think most anthropologists appreciate to different degrees. But then what's necessary is, of course, to devise political structures and institutions which are in accordance with those values. So you could argue that, in the United States, where we talk about equality and all men being created equal and so forth, there's a huge contradiction in terms of how we actually structure our society. And that does not actually take part in many ways. But it's not an absolute contradiction. There have been programs and there are times when we really do emphasize the equality, such in hiring processes at the university and so forth, probably go to a very conscientious extreme in many cases. But my more general point is that where you have some of the most developed partnership societies, they have as central core values such as caring for others, well-being of everybody, and that this is equally distributed across society. So you don't care for just some people, you care for everybody in the society. And therefore, this precludes being aggressive or dominating, harmful, depriving resources, of some people or some groups and so forth. So I lived almost 20 years in Finland. We say in anthropology, you're sort of like a child all over again because you don't know this culture you're coming into. So you have to be that child and try to learn what goes on and how are you supposed to behave and so forth. So one of my very first experiences in Finland was I was coming over there to be a visiting professor for a year. And I was talking to the immigration policewoman. And I said, well, what if I become sick or have an accident? Should I buy some insurance and how do I go about doing that? And she said, I don't understand. And I said, well, if say I, heaven forbid, I would get hit by a car or something, I'd have an accident, how would I be covered medically? And she says, well, of course you'd be treated. We would take care of you. It would be inhumane not to. And that was her exact words in that situation. So it really just, struck me. It's one thing when you hear abstractly about healthcare for all, and that's a good thing and so forth. But it's another thing when you move to a society and it's just automatic that way, and it would be inhumane not to. So we look at values and what sort of values are behind that type of statement. And what the Finns have done, and in fact, most European countries have set up healthcare systems and other types of social safety net, which are in place as a good governmental service to look after the people that governments are supposed to look after and take care of. So in many ways, the Nordic countries, and Finland in particular, highlight some of the things that hypocrisy or the contradictions in the United States, where we maintain that we should have fair access to resources and promote equality and democracy and so forth. But we're actually not doing, comparatively, we're not doing a very good job at that in compared to some other countries. It's important in a society, if you want to promote humanity and the overall good for people, is to think about how do we set up our social institutions and our practices that reflect these values. And I think that's an overall principle which can be manifested in many ways. So Ervin, you were just giving great examples of the police departments, retraining and changing the culture of the police. That's a specific type of way where you can say that this culture is emphasizing the wrong values and the wrong practices. So how are we going to change that culture, basically? And this can be done across a variety of different social institutions, from the political through the economic, et cetera, and so on.
I'm going to bring in David Livingstone Smith on this because both of you have touched on something that relates to this, and that is the ideas that underpin culture. And both of you have talked in your respective books about the frameworks of academia in a way. And I think, David Livingstone Smith, you made reference to the Darwinian revolution in your book and how that should have demolished the idea that nature's arranged as a hierarchy, and thus looking at human systems. And Doug's book relates to that to some degree as well. But let's start with you, David, and these ideas that sort of underpin our systems, perhaps in academia, but also in society.
Academia is becoming less and less relevant to society, unfortunately. So let's look at the big picture. Well, perhaps fortunately, actually, in some respects. So one of the things that concerns me, and of course, I endorse everything that Ervin and Doug has said. I mean, it's wonderful if police behave themselves. And it's wonderful to have decent nations that take care of their citizens. One of the things that concerns me, though, is when someone comes along and skillfully incentivizes other sorts of behavior. So I think it's really important to understand how that works, because just as you can sculpt human behavior in positive ways, you can also sculpt it in negative ways. And I think very often the people who get us to hurt each other have the most powerful stories because they trade on terror, they trade on fear. And I talk about this a little bit in On Humanity, but I'm writing about it quite a lot in the book that I hope to deliver to the publisher tonight, actually, after
Congratulations.
Is the remarkable staying power of destructive ideologies. So coincidentally, just as the COVID-19 pandemic was breaking out, I was writing a chapter on the 14th century bubonic plague. And the way that the bubonic plague provided fuel for those who were interested in slaughtering the people who they took to be the enemies of Christianity, which in Europe, of course, were the Jews, because most everyone else at this point had been eliminated who were non-Christians. So very peculiar beliefs emerged in the 14th century and a little before. And in subsequent centuries, they kind of seemed to wane after the Holocausts of the 14th century. I mean that with the full force of the word Holocaust. But you can see how extreme right-wing rhetoric in the wake of social pressure during the period after the First World War. And, what were the social pressures? There was the defeat of Germany in the war. There was the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. There was economic and political chaos. And there was the great pandemic of the Spanish flu. In that kind of hothouse environment, it was easy for people on the extreme right to revive and revitalize those very ideas which originated in the 14th century. I mean, it's quite remarkable if you make a close study of say, Nazi propaganda. But of course, the Nazis in the early days weren't the only group that were involved in it. They just happened to be the most successful one in the end. And so I think that adds a very important additional layer, right? We need not only to do the great things that Ervin is doing or has done with the New Orleans police, and that the Finns are doing to make their society a decent society. We must also be very, very vigilant about the potential when social ecologies change to revert to some of the worst things that people have ever done to one another.
Well, that's actually a perfect way to bring Ervin back in, because Ervin is not only a Holocaust survivor, but this is what most of his scholarship is on. In the framing, we call it framing in political communication. There is a genocidal frame, and that is the frame that is brought back. Ervin Staub, why don't we let you take this?
It's not only in Germany. Yes, you are right. They went back to ancient history. In the 5th century, the church, for the first time, used yellow stars. Martin Luther, the reformer, became extremely anti-Semitic when he couldn't convert Jews. He thought he could, then he couldn't, and all the language is there. Destructive ideologies very often arise from very difficult conditions of life. This is a summary term that I use for economic deterioration, social disorganization, political confusion, and so on. And what happens is that very basic human needs are frustrated. The need for security, the need for a positive identity. Who am I if I cannot take care of my family and protect myself? The need for having some control over important events. And at times like this, you don't have control. The need for an understanding of the world and your place in it when everything is disorganized and everything has changed. And what happens is that people begin to scapegoat others, usually already devalued groups in a society, and then they also come up with destructive ideologies. What is a destructive ideology in my framework? It's a vision of a better future and identifying groups of people who stand in the way of creating that better future. So in Rwanda, the destructive ideology was very simple: Hutu power, and Tutsis stood in the way of that. So then violence begins, there is an evolution. To me, the question is, how do we counteract this? How do we prevent this? How do we stop this? So one of the things that we did in Rwanda was we first had workshops for many different kinds of groups, including people who work with groups in the community, including national leaders and groups in between. And the workshops were about helping to understand how violence comes about, violence between groups, how the genocide happened. We never told them how the genocide we thought happened in Rwanda. We told them what are the influences that lead to genocide and how that took place in other countries. And then we asked them, is this applicable here? And as they applied it themselves to their situation, I believe they gained what I call an experiential understanding, which is much more than intellectual understanding. It was in their hearts and their bones. And so as we have them understand how these things happen, this resulted in some healing, a reduction in trauma symptoms. It resulted in more positive relations between the two groups. People were saying, if we understand it, we can prevent it. We then created educational radio programs so that it wasn't just small groups of people, but the whole society was exposed to this kind of an understanding. The core of this was radio dramas to engage people. We embedded in it this kind of understanding. One of the changes that took place was people were more willing to say what they believed in. Now, in Rwanda, that's a very big thing. It's a very authority-oriented society. People are following authorities. They don't like to speak out, but they were willing now to say what they believed. Not only did they say so, they actually did so. So the point is, we need to ask the question, how can we transform this situation? What is it that we need to accomplish? How can we go about accomplishing that? And who are the agents who can do this? These three questions apply to many situations. Understanding the roots of violence is only one particular avenue.
I wonder if we could go back to this we were talking about ideology, but also the ideas. Some of that, Doug Frye, you also talked about in your new book, the selfish gene idea, for example, you brought that up. How do you see these ideas shaping the direction into what you call the dominant model as opposed to the partnership model?
If you look across this long span of time, humanity has spent most of its existence on the planet living in small bands and mobile bands, moving around. And they've not been rigidly bounded. To the contrary, the pattern is that people are shifting membership across these bands If you're looking at a husband, wife, and kids, they may for a while live with some of the wife's relatives, but then they may meet up with a band where there's husband's relatives and switch over and so forth. So if you look across this type of society, you see that they're very independent and autonomous on the one hand, but they also understand that they really need other human beings. So they're also very caring and cooperative as well. And they've devised across this type of culture type just so many ways to deal with conflicts that minimize lethality and keep them from spreading and getting into large-scale situations. I've written quite a bit on this, and I'm just trying to summarize, because it's really important to understand when you're thinking about human nature that what we're seeing today and what we've seen over a historical, mostly a Western past that we're used to looking at and thinking of is not really a good reflection of what the species is like. And again, there's huge flexibility in humanity. So what Rhiannon and I have highlighted, and this has been largely my contribution to the book, is to bring in the anthropology to the domination and partnership continuum. And by this, I mean that domination or inequality really did arise very recently in an archaeological sense, 12, 13,000 years ago at the earliest, but in some places much more recently. And of course, as we see the rise of the first ancient states, the first civilizations, that's only 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. That's nothing when we're thinking back about how our species has evolved over millennia. And so this was a huge cultural, environmental type of change that occurred with human societies, or some human societies. So this type of long span perspective, in combination with thinking about domination societies versus partnership, in combination with trying to see what this tells us about human nature, is that one, humans are flexible, but two, this type of social organization that we find ourselves living in is really, really important in terms of how we behave, the values we hold, the patterns of interactions, whether we're living in a hierarchy or whether we're living in an egalitarian type of society. So when we're talking about recent history and Western history, that's all hierarchy. That's geared towards domination. Now, obviously, again, it's a continuum. You get mixes of these things, and no society is strictly domination. We all need to cooperate in different ways within the society and get along with each other. And infants need to be raised and cared for and so forth. So it's not an absolute. It's more of a matter of degree. So in terms of thinking about human nature, I've argued in different publications and presentations and so forth, that if there's anything that we tend towards, and I like to say it that way, that we have a tendency towards, it's tending and befriending and caring, conflict resolving, showing restraint against being really aggressive. We'll get booted out of the group or we'll get killed ourselves. So it's a rather pro-social picture that we lean towards, and that's all partnership. But relatively recently, in the frame of things, you get the very first chieftainships evolving. You get some social complexity coming in. Everything changed dramatically when this happens. Groups settle down. They have to use resources more intensively. Hierarchies develop. Warfare comes in. And what anthropology shows, and this is largely ignored, but there's lots of great examples of very recent origins of war. And these come in with social complexity. So this type of long-spanning and cross-cultural anthropological view on things, I think really is useful if you want to look at human nature. We can't just look around us today and say, oh my God, Rwanda genocide, that's horrible. And look at all the Holocaust and various historical examples. Obviously, humans have that capacity to be inhumane and to torture and to practice genocide. That's a capacity. But I would argue that's just one of our capacities. We also have the partnership, the caring, befriending, and less aggressive ways in which our societies have existed for millennia. So I think, and this will be interesting to hear what David has to say about this in particular. So we talk about evolutionary questions. I know you've written, David, on restraint, and I have as well. So I think that's a largely overlooked area. So much focus on the violence and the aggression and so little on how actually we control it and we inhibit our nastiness in many ways.
You've been prompted, David Livingstone Smith.
I'm a little bit more agnostic about ways of life in prehistory than Doug is, particularly in deep prehistory. If we're going pre-Neolithic, there's just very little evidence to draw firm conclusions. And there's, of course, very little evidence for the people who confidently claim that human beings were quite violent during that period. It's a very popular view. It's been promoted by some people. I accepted it at one point, but I've come to revise my views, looking at the archaeological and paleo and anthropological evidence. I avoid the notion of human nature because, like Doug, I think that we are remarkably flexible creatures, that we have a variety of potentials. And in a way, that's part of our problem. So we invented this thing called culture. And culture, to some extent, is a kind of human self-engineering. So through cultural practices, human beings have found ways of getting themselves to do things that would otherwise be unthinkable. Now, some of those things are really good, and some of those things are really bad. So if one were to pin me down, say, okay, David, okay, you said that stuff about human nature, you don't buy, but really when it comes down to it, aren't there claims about the human organism, our behavior, our propensities that you would endorse? And there are. We're a hyper-social species. We're super, 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 super social. I mean, you have to look at the ants and the bees, who obviously are extraordinarily different from us, to find organisms that are as social as we are. And certainly no other primate is, not by a long shot. Now, any social animal must, just by definition, have powerful inhibitions against acts of violence, particularly lethal violence. That doesn't mean that social animals never commit acts of lethal violence. They do. I mean, disputes get out of hand. But even among chimpanzees, violent disputes in the group, they tend to be non-lethal. But we also have these great big brains, and we're able to reason instrumentally and to think to ourselves, well, wouldn't it be advantageous? And I think this stuff came pretty much, and this is speculation, right? But I think it came pretty much after we have agriculture and sedentary societies, because there are different kinds of demands on human groups when they're in that position. But wouldn't it be really helpful if we just wiped out our neighbors because we could steal their stuff and create Lebensraum and exploit their labor and so on and so forth? Okay, but then that meets what I think are just fundamental inhibitions against same species violence that we have. And they must be very powerful inhibitions because we are very, very, very social creatures. Well, over the millennia, we've found, unfortunately, cultural gimmicks for disabling those inhibitions. And there are many, from ritual practices to the use of intoxicants to dehumanizing propaganda and certain forms of religious ideologies. So my point where I was trying to get to there is that to do these really awful things to other human beings, I think requires input from the outside. It requires certain sorts of cultural influences. Dehumanization doesn't arise spontaneously from within. It's a response to certain kinds of propaganda, certain kinds of inculcations of beliefs and feelings and projects. And with respect then to academia is one force that can and indeed has historically often operated in that sort of way. Because the thing is, we tend to defer to authority. All of us do, because most of our beliefs come from people who are supposed to know, who are in positions of epistemic authority. And that's kind of a vulnerability, because very often, of course, people in positions of epistemic authority, they are trustworthy, and we should accept what they say. When the physicist says that what looks like a gapless table in front of me is actually mostly empty space, I should accept that. But the problem is when a Nazi race expert tells me that Jews are subhuman vermin, I might be equally inclined to accept that. And then that serves to undermine and disable these very natural inhibitions I have against doing awful things to other people.
Just a reminder that you are listening to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian, and we're speaking with three preeminent scholars about the crossroads that we face today in these tumultuous times. Ervin Staub, I think you're next. One of the things that comes to my mind in this conversation is whether or not some of the effects of what David has talked about, and I think others have talked about as well, are really impossible to overcome, like the idea of an authoritarian personality, for example, or the idea of psychopathology, for example. I mean, I don't want to give a diagnosis to the President of the United States, but one does have to wonder. So, Ervin Staub, you're the psychologist on the panel. What wisdom do you have on this?
I want to say first that I agree with a lot of what David said, but not everything. It's true that propaganda and that kind of influence makes a very big difference. If you tell somebody that person is evil, actually there is a research project when people who supervise others and have the opportunity to punish them if they make mistakes overhear a communication, accidentally supposedly, in which the people whom they are supervising are derogated. They punish them more. If they overhear a communication in which those people are praised, they punish them less. But a lot of what happens is a function not of communications to us, but our experience. So watch young children. They sometimes tear a toy out of the hand of another child. Sometimes they push another child. Sometimes they push over a tower that another child built. And let's assume that there are no reactions to this whatsoever. Not any praise, but nobody says, don't do this. And they are likely to do it more. And again, nobody says, don't do this. And they are likely to do it more. So given our experiences and without influences to move us in a positive direction, we can become quite violent. And of course, I mentioned before that being physically punished also makes a person more violent. So our experiences matter crucially. And I think that in terms of our human nature, we are very malleable. But that malleability expresses itself also through learning through our experience, as well as learning through what other people guide us to and tell us, and so on. One of my favorite phrases became over time what I call inclusive caring. How can we raise children in such a way that they care about other people, but not only other people in their own family and in their own group, but that caring expands beyond the boundaries of the group and becomes inclusive. And I think that that is a function of both experience and guidance, the combination of the two. Now, I really wish I remembered what it is that Maria asked me to talk about. Could you repeat?
I don't know if I can repeat it, but I will try to get back to the idea of it, which is whether or not we have developed some people in society along the lines of the authoritarian personality or psychopaths that really are just so fundamentally different from us now that we can't build a society like what we're talking about with them.
Interesting. The police is instructive in regards to this. We haven't done research recently, but once upon a time, people have done research with people who joined the police. And they found that a good number of them had authoritarian tendencies. So if what I described to you works, peer intervention has become a crucial phase now, following what happened to George Floyd. Then we will see whether actually it is the case that regardless of what kind of authority orientation people enter the police, this can be overcome by the creation of a new culture in which superior officers reward intervention, and intervention becomes something that officers see how valuable that is. So there has been research that showed that people with very extreme orientations, and I'm talking about extreme negative orientations, extreme negative values, are very difficult to change. People in the middle can be changed. What we don't know is to what extent when the middle and the culture of various groups changes to a significant degree, what happens to those people who still hold some of those characteristics? Will they be able to adjust and align themselves with the group as a whole, or will they become outliers and rebels who engage in various kinds of negative and violent behavior?
Or do they become president?
Do they become presidents? Well, unfortunately, right now, given the circumstances, it's really, let's let our hair down even if you don't have any. It's totally flabbergasting that somebody like Donald Trump could become the president of the United States. And it is even more flabbergasting and dangerous, the possibility that he could be reelected. And it's not impossible, but it's just amazing thing, because the chaos, the disorder, the everything that he has created, and I don't need to talk about that. We all know, people who are going to listen to your program all know, but it is really quite amazing.
David Smith, you probably have something to say about that.
Oh, well, yes. Yes, I do. So again, I cannot disagree with anything you said, Ervin, but I will add another layer to it and very quickly get onto the Trump issue. All of us have experienced vulnerability, all of us. It's part of being a human being. And where destructive propaganda really, I think, gets its leverage is through playing on our feelings of vulnerability, getting us to feel more vulnerable, and then offering us magical solutions, salvation, as it were, from our vulnerability. I've seen that in every genocide that I've studied, and I saw it in Donald Trump. So I've been writing about Donald Trump since 2016. In fact, when I saw him come down that escalator and announce his candidacy, and then I listened to the speech he made, I thought to myself, this is a very dangerous man. But all my friends were saying, oh, he's a fool, he's a clown, and so on, because the moves that he made were precisely out of the Nazi playbook. I mean, he got his audience first to feel depressed. We're the laughing stock of the world. We've been taken advantage of, and so on. And then paranoid. But it's, the enemies without and within that are eating away at our society. And then he offers the magical solution, make America great again. I'm the only one to do it. And this is one of the things that really, really worries me, that we can make all sorts of really great changes, and I'm entirely in favor of those. But when things get hard and we have skillful salvation salesmen, people are vulnerable. And I think one of the things we have to do is help people learn both about their vulnerabilities to this sort of rhetoric, and we have to be extremely vigilant about it, in the external world, right? Because it can be so transformative in very, very, very negative ways.
It's true that under certain circumstances, we become very vulnerable because, as I said before, our deepest human needs are frustrated. And these are not needs that we can ignore. We can say, oh, I'm going to fulfill them next week. They are present with us and they press on us and they look for fulfillment. And joining a community, some kind of an ideological community, helps to some extent fulfill these needs. Not fully, but together with others, you have actions that you can take to promote your leader and your vision, so you don't feel as helpless as before. Being part of the community not only gives you connection, but also gives you a sense of security. So for all these reasons, ideological communities can be very fulfilling for people in dangerous times and very dangerous. So what do we do? And I think that what we need to do is, when there are no such dangerous times, we really have to attend of preparing people for those times so that they can act early and effectively, and they can create constructive communities rather than ideological, destructive communities who come together and support people. Okay, it wasn't really a community, but one of the things happened at the time of the Great Depression here is that Roosevelt created those work programs. So it wasn't quite a community, but people were working together. And at the same time, they came to feel that they are part of the nation. They were not hanging out there, drying, being blown by the wind. They were part of the national project and they were kind of taken care of. So it wasn't just the material support, it was the psychological needs that were getting fulfilled that way. And what we have to do is we have to prepare people to how to join together in constructive communities so that they support each other when times get rough.
Doug Frye, I wonder if you could bring the whole thing into a wrap.
Ervin and I had met before, and I was talking something about peaceful societies. And that's one way to try to wrap this together. There really are societies that have that sense of community. They are small, they are large, they exist around the world. And they focus on the pro-social and the community parts of things, and they do what Ervin was proposing. You have that solid base of understanding and solidarity and working together and being part of something, which I think is very important to maintaining their peacefulness. So we could learn that lesson. I'm also thinking about identity as I've been listening to the discussion here. This comes akin to what you said, Ervin, again, in terms of inclusive caring. I like to use this phrase, expand the us to include the them, as an anecdote or an alternative to the us versus the them. Let's expand the us to include the them and have an overall inclusive identity. And again, this is not just something that I've thought up as a cute saying, but you can look out ethnographically or anthropologically and see that some of the most remarkable non-warring systems do exactly this. They have an overarching sense of identity, and over time, then war just drops out as something that becomes unthinkable amongst these neighboring groups, these neighboring societies. So the overall lesson here, and I'm trying to pull together, is, first of all, obviously humans have this flexibility we've talked about. They have the capacity to do great evil and engage in great inhumanity, but we also have this potential to be very humane, loving, and caring. And as we've looked with horror at this recent police killing in Minnesota, people around the planet responded with the humanity response to this. Not everybody, of course, but we've seen it literally around the planet and certainly in this country. So we have this capability. We can become totally incensed and outraged when we see this type of inhumanity, and yet the paradox is we also engage in it. So it really requires, I think, as David has said, great consideration of what are the conditions that allow us to be inhumane, but also more lines of what I'm saying and what Ervin at some points of the discussion has also been saying is how can we really build on the humanity as well. So there, I've tried to wrap it up.
I think it's perfect. I think all three of you are fabulous. It has been such a joy to have you three together. I thank you all for your research, your thoughts, and for sharing them with each other and with me and our audiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria.
Okay, guys. Ervin Staub is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His books include Overcoming Evil, Genocide, a Violent Conflict, and Terrorism, and The Roots of Goodness, Inclusive Caring, Moral Courage, Altruism Born of Suffering, Active Bystandership, and Heroism. Doug Frye is professor and chairperson in the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He's the author of Beyond War, The Human Potential for Peace. With Rian Eisler, he co-authored Nurturing Our Humanity, How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Minds, Lives, and Future. David Livingstone Smith is a professor of philosophy at the University of New England. He's the author of The Most Dangerous Animal, Human Nature and the Origins of War, Less Than Human, Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others, and On Inhumanity, Dehumanization and How to Resist It. Thank you to our guests and to you for listening. The Scholars Circle team includes Doug Becker and Lillian Ng, contributing hosts, Ankine Agassian and Melissa Chiprin, managing producers, Sud Dongre, our webmaster, Tim Page and Mike Hurst, engineers and technical support. I'm Maria Armoudian, and we'll see you next week.